biting wind was a physical blow, stealing breath, searing skin. Snow piled against the small, still form, threatening to bury her completely. Her fingers, stiff claws of ice, scraped uselessly at the frozen earth beneath the drift. Pain had long since retreated, replaced by a vast, encroaching numbness, a silent surrender the body enacted when hope was fully extinguished. She had been left here, a burden shed, a problem solved with brutal simplicity under the indifferent, gray sky. The faces of those who had abandoned her flickered behind her eyelids, hard, unforgiving, devoid of the pity she had foolishly begged for. They saw weakness. The storm saw simply another obstacle to consume. Her name felt like a whisper from a life she no longer inhabited. Alara. It held no meaning now, no warmth against the relentless cold that seeped into her very bones. The world was reduced to the ache in her chest, the shallow, rattling gasp of her lungs, the swirling white void that encompassed sight and sound. She thought of fire once, a distant memory of a hearth, but the image was too feeble to compete with the absolute dominion of ice. This was the end, she knew. A quiet, frozen dissolution into the landscape that had promised sanctuary and delivered only solitude and death. Then, a shadow fell across the snow, not the fleeting, ephemeral shadow of a cloud, but something solid, grounded. It paused, large and dark against the blinding white. A sound, muffled by the storm, reached her, a low exclamation, rough and questioning. Fear, a cold, sharp pinprick, pierced through the numbness. Had they returned? To ensure the job was finished? She tried to shrink further into the snow, a futile instinct. A heavy boot crunched nearby. A hand, large and calloused, reached down, its touch surprisingly gentle as it brushed snow from her face. The face that looked down was weathered, framed by a thick, frost-dusted beard. The eyes the color of a stormy sea, unreadable but intensely focused. Not one of them, a stranger. He knelt, a grunt of effort escaping him. He didn't speak, not words she could understand, just a low murmur, perhaps to himself, perhaps to the wind. He checked for breath, his movement economical, deliberate. Finding it against all logic, he made a decision. She felt herself being lifted, cradled against a rough wool coat that smelled faintly of wood smoke and earth. The motion was jarring, painful, but it stirred something else too, a faint, fragile spark of awareness. She was not gone yet. She was being carried, away from the snow, away from the waiting silence of the grave. He carried her with surprising strength, navigating the deep drifts with practiced ease. The journey was a blur of muffled sounds and the rhythmic thud of his boots. When he finally stopped, setting her down carefully, she was dimly aware of shelter, of air that wasn't purely ice. The last thing she registered before darkness claimed her completely was the faint glow of embers, promising a warmth she could barely remember. She woke slowly, the world resolving itself piece by piece. First, the overwhelming sensation of warmth, not the biting heat of fever, but the deep, pervasive comfort of being thawed from the inside out. Then, the smell of wood smoke, stronger now, mingled with something earthy and animal. Her eyes fluttered open to a low, rough-hewn ceiling, smoke-stained rafters visible in the dim light filtering through a single, small window layered with frost. She was in a small, sparsely furnished cabin. On a cot, bundled in thick, scratchy blankets. Her body ached in every joint, a dull throb replacing the ice. A figure sat by the hearth, a large silhouette against the firelight, mending harness with quiet concentration. The man who had found her. He didn't seem to notice she was awake at first. Or perhaps he did, and chose not to remark upon it. His silence was not hostile, merely present. She watched him, wary, her mind still sluggish from the ordeal. Who was he? Why had he saved her? What did he expect in return? The questions circled, silent, unanswered. After a long while, he shifted, placing the mended harness aside. He stood, stretching slowly, a man used to hard labor. Then he turned towards her. His gaze was direct, assessing, but still held that unreadable quality. He didn't smile, didn't offer any greeting. Instead, he walked to a small table, poured water from a ceramic jug into a cup, and brought it to her. "Drink," he said, his voice a low rumble, as sparse and unadorned as the cabin. It was the first word she had heard him speak. She hesitated, then her parched throat compelled her. She took the cup, her hand trembling slightly. The water was cold, clear, and impossibly refreshing. She drank slowly, his eyes still on her, not pushing, just waiting. When she finished, he took the cup, set it back, and returned to his chair by the fire. He didn't ask her name or why she was in the snow. He simply let her be. Days blurred into a quiet rhythm. She remained weak, sleeping often. He provided simple food, broth, hard bread, occasionally dried meat. He spoke only when necessary, usually just a few words about the weather or a task he was undertaking. His name, she learned from overhearing him speaking to his dog, a shaggy, silent creature that stayed mostly outside, was Thomas. He was a farmer, isolated, tending to a small patch of land and a few animals against the relentless mountain winter. There were no other signs of life for miles. His isolation was profound and seemingly his choice. Gradually, her strength returned. The gnawing fear of his intentions began to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity, then a tentative gratitude. He made no demands, expected nothing. He simply existed alongside her, a quiet sentinel in the storm. She started moving around the cabin, testing her limbs. The first time she managed to stand for a sustained period, he glanced over, a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes, but said nothing. His acceptance was passive, undemanding. It was in this lack of expectation that a fragile seed of trust began to sprout. He had saved her life, asked nothing, and let her heal in silence. It was a kindness so profound, so unexpected after the cruelty she had known, that it felt like a new kind of warmth, deeper than the fire. As her strength grew, so did a restless need to contribute, to pull her own weight in this quiet, isolated world. She couldn't bear the thought of being a burden, a drain on the scarce resources he possessed. One morning, seeing him preparing to haul water from the frozen stream, she spoke, her voice raspy but clear, the words feeling strange on her tongue after so much silence. "Let me help," he paused, turning to look at her. His gaze lingered for a moment, considering. Then, without speaking, he simply nodded and handed her a smaller bucket. Working alongside him was another lesson in his nature. He was efficient, tireless, and spoke even less when focused on a task. He didn't offer instructions unless she faltered, and then they were brief, to the point. There was no judgment in his silence, only the shared understanding of labor. They hauled water, chopped wood, tended to the few animals. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, the set of his jaw, the narrow of his eyes, a language unspoken but deeply communicative. He saw her efforts, acknowledged them with a nod or a shared glance, and that was enough. Trust solidified not through words, but through shared sweat and mutual reliance against the harsh environment. One bitter afternoon, a rider approached. The sound of hooves on frozen ground carried unnaturally far in the still air. Thomas stopped what he was doing, his body tensing almost imperceptibly. He looked towards the track leading to his cabin, his expression hardening. Alara's blood ran cold. Visitors were clearly rare here. Who would come? A dread she thought she had outrun surged back. She stepped closer to the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. Thomas watched the approaching rider, his hand resting near the axe handle buried in a log. He didn't look at her, but she felt his silent presence, a solid, protective anchor in her rising panic. The rider drew closer, resolving into a familiar, unwelcome shape. It was a man she knew, one of those who had been present on the day she was abandoned. His face, under a wide-brimmed hat, was narrow and cruel. He reined in his horse a short distance from the cabin, his eyes sweeping over the small homestead, then landing on Alara, who stood partially hidden by Thomas's broad frame. A smirk spread across his face. "Well," "Well," he called out, his voice carrying on the wind. "Look what the snow didn't take. Thought you were finished." He looked at Thomas, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "She yours, farmer? You know who she is?" Thomas stepped slightly forward, placing himself more fully between Alara and the rider. His stance was not aggressive, but utterly immovable. "She is under my roof," he said, his voice low and steady, the tone leaving no room for argument. "She stays," the rider laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Under your roof? Or just under your thumb? She owes debts. Debts that need collecting. We came back for what's ours," he gestured vaguely, implying not just goods, but Alara herself. Thomas didn't move. His gaze was unwavering, meeting the rider's challenge head-on. The air crackled with unspoken threat. Alara, watching from behind Thomas, felt a surge of something unexpected, not just fear, but a fierce, protective loyalty towards the silent man who stood between her and her past. She wouldn't be taken again. Not if she could help it. The rider's hand drifted towards his side, hovering near a pistol butt. The air grew colder, the silence broken only by the restless shifting of the horse. Thomas didn't flinch. His hand remained steady on the axe handle. The message was clear. Cross this threshold, and there would be a price. The rider held his gaze for a long moment, calculating. He saw the quiet strength in the farmer's stance, the unyielding set of his shoulders. Perhaps he saw something in Alara too, a spark of resilience that hadn't been there before. He sneered. "This ain't over, farmer. Folks don't forget." With that empty threat hanging in the air, he turned his horse and rode away, back the way he came, swallowed by the vast white landscape. Alara let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at Thomas, her eyes filled with gratitude and awe. He had faced down danger for her, a complete stranger, simply because she was under his protection. He turned then, his expression softening almost imperceptibly as he looked at her. He didn't ask if she was all right, or explain his actions. He simply nodded, a gesture that spoke volumes of acceptance and quiet solidarity. The confrontation was brief, but it was a turning point. It solidified the unspoken bond between them. The man who had pulled her from the snowdrift had now shielded her from the cruelty of men. She was no longer just a survivor taking refuge. She was part of this small, isolated world he had built. Her fear of him had vanished completely, replaced by a deep respect and an unexpected warmth. She found her voice more often now, speaking not just of necessity, but sharing small observations about the day, the animals, the weather. He listened more than he spoke, but his occasional brief responses were thoughtful, acknowledging her presence, her thoughts. As winter slowly receded, giving way to the tentative thaw of spring, Alara felt a thaw within herself. The numbness that had encased her heart was melting, revealing not just the pain of the past, but also a renewed capacity for feeling, for connection. She helped Thomas prepare the fields for planting, her hands, once frozen claws, now strong and capable, working the soil alongside his. The earth was cold and damp, but promising. It felt like a mirror of her own journey, breaking through frozen layers to find life beneath. The question of her future lingered, unspoken. Where would she go? What would she do? The world outside this valley held painful memories, faces she never wanted to see again. But staying? Was that even an option? Thomas never pressed her, never asked about her past or her plans. He simply allowed her to exist, to heal, to work. His acceptance was a silent invitation, not spoken aloud, but etched in the shared tasks, the quiet evenings by the fire, the way his gaze met hers across the small cabin. One evening, sitting outside as the last light bled from the sky, Alara finally spoke the words she had held back for so long. "Thank you, Thomas." She didn't elaborate, didn't need to. He knew she meant more than just for saving her from the snow. He meant for everything: the shelter, the food, the silence, the protection, the quiet dignity he had afforded her. He turned his head, looking out at the valley. "It is what a body does," he said, his voice quiet. "Pull another from the cold." His simplicity was profound. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a man doing what needed doing. She looked at him, at the strength in his profile, the kindness hidden beneath his stoic exterior. She had been left to die, stripped of everything. But in the hands of this quiet farmer, she had not only survived, she had been given the chance to rebuild, stronger, more whole than before. Her resilience, tested by the storm and human cruelty, had found fertile ground in his quiet acceptance. She had come seeking shelter from the snow, and found instead a place where she could bloom again. The future was uncertain. The world still held dangers, but she faced it now not with despair, but with a quiet strength forged in fire and ice, and tempered by the simple courage of a man who saw a life worth saving and simply did. She was a Lara survivor, yes, but more than that. She was here, and she was ready.